we had a lot of protests over the weekend in all 50 states, and then we had Uncut protests. I'm going to tell you about that in a second. I want to fill you in on everything that's going on. First, the outrage against the governor of Wisconsin's brutal union-busting budget bill is still going strong. This morning, Governor Scott Walker's administration locked down the Capitol. They're no longer allowing any protesters in. Now, he took this drastic step after an astonishing weekend of rallies. Madison saw its biggest protest yet on Saturday. More than 70,000 people braved the snow and freezing temperatures to stand up for their rights. And they weren't alone. Thousands of people showed up in capitals across the country to show their solidarity with the Wisconsin workers. In addition to the union rallies, this weekend saw the birth of a separate movement of people-powered protests that some are calling the liberal version of the Tea Party, because it's actually about real populism, not one paid for by billionaires like the Koch brothers. Now, the movement is called Uncut and is modeled after a grassroots effort in the United Kingdom that publicizes companies that avoid paying taxes by staging protests designed to disrupt their daily operations. And the new U.S. group has plenty of potential targets to choose from. Why? Because a report from the Government Accountability Office shows that between 1998 and 2005, two-thirds of U.S. corporations paid no taxes. Now, come on, what are the chances that two-thirds of the companies didn't have to pay taxes? They made money. They avoided taxes. And in 2008, 83 of the 100 largest public corporations in the U.S. used offshore accounts, that's tax havens, to hide income to avoid taxation. Now, look, when you don't pay your taxes, you go to jail. You're called a tax cheat, and they say, how dare you? That is so immoral. When corporations do it, they're just avoiding taxes. Well, isn't that pleasant? Wouldn't you like to avoid your taxes? Too bad you don't have an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. So it makes a lot of sense for these uncut people to say, how about they pay their taxes? And then we could have real shared pain. And by the way, taxes shouldn't be paid. They should be normal. We all pay them. Why don't they pay them? So this weekend, the Uncut protest targeted Bank of America. Why? Well, get a load of this. Bank of America got $45 billion in taxpayer-funded bailout money. Now, that's a lot of money. Well, it turns out that in 2009, their profit was $4.4 billion. Now, I'd make $4.4 billion, too, if I wound up getting all that money for free, basically. But by using various tax loopholes, they paid zero in taxes, nada, zilch, squat. In fact, are you ready for this? They actually received $1.9 billion in tax benefits. Now, how would you like to have tax benefits? I'd love to have that, too. Why, Mr. Uygur, you've received a tax benefit today. But unfortunately, I didn't buy any politicians, so I don't get that. Now, Uncut members showed up in cities from New York to San Francisco and had some success from their first time out. In San Francisco, dozens of protesters stood in line to cash fake checks that would cover Bank of America's unpaid taxes. That action alone resulted in the branch shutting down briefly, saying, okay, I got it. You bring in these fake checks. And look, they wanted to disrupt their business to make a point, and they did. Now, with the Wisconsin protests, and now these Uncut protests, liberals are finally getting energized, which I love. Real middle-class people are turning out in droves to fight for their rights. We talked about it last week. Don't wait for anyone from D.C. Don't wait for any politicians. You get out there, you affect change, and now they're doing all across the country. So now to help me talk about that is Ryan Clayton. He's the co-founder of the U.S. Uncut, and he was at the Washington, D.C. protest over the weekend. Also joining me is Justin Ruben. He's the executive director of MoveOn.org. All right, Ryan, let me start with you. Tell me more about U.S. Uncut. What is the main mission here?
Well, hey, Cenk, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of the show. U.S. Uncut is a grassroots organization that self-organizes through social media, and we call out corporate tax dodgers so that we don't have to go and cut valuable public services.
All right. Now, so you're calling these things out. What is your ultimate goal?
Our goal is to have the politicians make the decision they should have made years ago, which is to pass the Stop Tax Haven Abuse Act and make sure that, companies like Bank of America can't make $4.4 billion in 2009 and then pay $0 in income taxes, because that has a real cost to us as the community. If they would pay their tax bill in 2009 alone, we could avoid $1.7 billion in early childhood education cuts and Head Start and Title I programs. I think that's a choice worth making.
Justin, I know MoveOn was instrumental in the Wisconsin protests and the protests across the country. Yep. Talking about Wisconsin, corporate income tax dodging in Wisconsin alone apparently cost $113 million in lost revenue, and internet sales tax loophole cost $127 million in lost revenue. And by the way, the budget deficit was only $137 million for 2011. So,
and then I understand that this budget crisis, they made it worse by actually giving a new tax break to corporations, immediately before launching this attack on workers' rights that was supposedly because of the budget crisis.
Right. Walker talked about giving away about $140 million in tax breaks, loopholes, et cetera, et cetera. So, what do you make of this? Do you think that if people get together like this, obviously, in Wisconsin, it's having some effect because it's in Ohio and Indiana, et cetera. They've stopped the momentum of going after public unions. But with Uncut, do you think that they could have also a further effect in saying, hey, you know what? Maybe the giant corporations should also pay their fair share.
Well, I think what's happening in Washington and around the country is exactly the same thing that's happening in Wisconsin. It's that that Republicans are so bent on giving tax breaks to corporations and to their millionaire backers that they're willing to literally, in the new Republican budget, they're going to take food away from pregnant women and children who are hungry in order to safeguard their corporate tax breaks. So, I think what U.S. Uncut is doing is great. We had over 150,000 people on that at the same time that those protests were happening, drawing attention to these banks that aren't paying their fair share. We had 150,000 people around the country just standing up to say, look, the American dream is under attack. We are not going to stand for this anymore. And all of it really inspired by what's happening in Wisconsin.
So what's MoveOn's next plans?
Well, I think over the next couple weeks, we have to turn our attention, even as we continue to stand in solidarity with the brave folks in Wisconsin, to what's happening in Washington, D.C., because Republicans have proposed this budget. Not only are they going to cut aid to pregnant women and children, they're going to cut education, they want to cut health care, all of it to pay for tax cuts for the rich. And they've said they're going to shut down the government to do it. And we have about 2 weeks to stop that. And I think, so over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be working to raise awareness about what's happening and make sure all of that anger gets heard in Washington.
All right, Ryan, you guys handed out $1.5 billion checks in San Francisco. Tell me what that was about. Why that number?
Well, that was a great local organizer, Joanne Gifford, who had a great idea, and they went and they kept cashing $1.5 billion checks at the Bank of America location, which effectively shut down the bank. And it was a great idea that we're going to replicate all across the country. So Bank of America, get ready. We're coming back, and we're coming back soon. I'd encourage everybody to go to usuncut.org. And if there's not local events in your area, create them, join them, be out there with us. Because we're going to make this point that if they would just do this one thing, if they would just make corporations pay their fair share, we could solve every state budget crisis without cutting one more teacher. We could fix the federal budget without touching Social Security, and we could put millions of Americans back to work and drive down unemployment. We pay our taxes. Why don't they?
All right, Ryan, a lot of people will say, hey, wait a minute, disrupting businesses. We can't have that. That's un-American. How dare you? They've got to keep making money. How do you respond to that?
I say cheating is un-American, and billionaire corporations have already abandoned America for foreign tax havens, and they have paid $0 in income taxes here in America, and they keep their profits in international banks, and they ship millions of jobs overseas. That is simply un-American.
All right, the last question for you, Justin.
Sure.
I know that a lot of the Democrats in the Senate are already mid-buckle on these spending cuts. So how do you fight back?
There's always hope.
Okay, but how do you fight back? Just maybe not even short term, but also long term, right. Because in the short term, the Democrats will buckle. Look, I'm keeping it real.
Well, look, the debate over the economy has been really one-sided in this country for the last couple of years. It's, are we going to have massive, terrible cuts or a lot of cuts? Right? So, right, I think exactly. We have to come out and articulate the alternative, which is exactly what Ryan's talking about, that we should be investing in education, investing in health care, and making sure that corporations and the rich pay their fair share. And I think the wave of energy that you're seeing around the country, look, in Wisconsin, 14 Democrats stood up and did the right thing, and they did that because the people came out and demanded it. So I think we have to look to Democrats in Washington to do the exact same thing.
Right, whether it's short-term or long-term, if you keep showing up, at some point somebody winds up having the courage to actually back you up. So Ryan Clayton from Uncut and MoveOn.org's Justin Ruben, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks a lot.
Guys. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks a lot.